Hi, Brent Swallow here again, lecturing on AREC 173, Plate, Planet, and Society for the week of October 5th to 9th. And this will be one set of slides for mini lectures for this week. So I'm going to share my screen with you and jump into this material. The connection to Module 3 is important to get us going. Module 3, we ended our section on kind of local food and place-based food by thinking about the environmental impacts of local food compared to food which might be sourced from further away. And we came to the conclusion that you couldn't make any presumption that local food is always going to be better for the environment, that it depends on the environment conditions in the locality where the food was produced, as well as the environmental impacts of moving the food and processing food in different places. And there might be such advantages in terms of lower environmental impact in some places that it offsets the disadvantages of producing food and needing to transport food further from where it's produced to where it's consumed. So we thought through kind of, are there some principles around that? We focused on greenhouse gases. That's the major kind of numeraire or kind of aggregator of environmental impact. But we now want to kind of break that out to think about climate change for sure, but also think about the other ways that agriculture affects the environment. Now, here's just a slide to remind us about the objectives that are listed in the syllabus for this Module 4 on sustainable food production and environmental impacts of agriculture. So for us to think about environmentally sustainable production, we have to think about how can we minimize negative environmental impacts, how can we maximize the contribution that agriculture might make to key elements of the environment. We're going to define lots of concepts today. I'm going to try to illustrate those concepts with some cases that I'm pretty familiar with in many of the examples, as well as going to kind of move into the idea of the planetary boundaries, right? And the other thing to use is we're going to use cases of water use and Amazon deforestation to illustrate these in a deeper way. We could spend the whole rest of the class just on different cases of environmental impact and how to reduce that. But now we're going to provide kind of some overview, big picture concepts, and then a couple cases to illustrate. Here are kind of 5 takeaways that I hope that you're going to get from this module, as well as many others. The first one is that agriculture has had in the past and continues to have massive and profound impacts on the environment at many scales, right? From plot scale or field scale or the garden size, right up to the global scale and everything in between. And we're going to illustrate that with a few, some specific ways that agriculture affects the environment, which are listed here. Second takeaway is that how and where and when agriculture is practiced matters. It does shape how negative or possibly positive the effect of agriculture is, or different types of agriculture. The third thing is that, that there are ecological processes and principles at play, which including emergent properties and lateral flows, which mean that a solution which may make good sense right from the say a farm scale for an individual farmer making a decision, this is what makes sense for them, that may not make sense at the scale, at another scale, even at the plot scale, or at the scale, say, of a watershed or a nation or an ecosystem, or at the global scale. Emergent properties here are things which, in ecological terms, which are manifest at some scale of aggregation, but don't really show themselves at a lower scale. So that might be something like water use at a plot scale, you may just see the water and water flows off of that. You don't really are too concerned about where that goes, depending on how water is used on your own field. That might have effect on other fields, and it might, at a watershed scale, might have a major problem with sedimentation, say, of a dam. Another key concept from ecology is the idea of lateral flows, things which connect different parts of our landscape together, are often connected by flows through the air, the flows of water over ground, or even material flows across a landscape. And we can also have lateral flows of food, right? If we're moving food from one kind of foodscape that people think about to another foodscape, that's a flow, or you could think of that as a lateral flow. These have both ecological meaning as well as they have clear meaning in economic terms. We think of lateral flows often as externalities. If we're lateral flows, so say of water or air or soil. If these are lateral flows of food, then we think about the kind of the market system that that prices things and moves things from producers to consumers. In terms of, so what about economics? This is a class about economics and ethics of food production and consumption. There are economic drivers which pressure many of these problems, cause many of the problems. And there will be economic incentives and economic principles that are going to help us understand what's feasible to change the system, say to a more positive system, or what, how the policy environment may be shaping that. Finally, that there are both, while there are economic dimensions to these problems, there are also ethical dimensions and ethical challenges involved. So we'll be thinking back as we go through this to some of the other, the earlier discussion we had about ethics. The outline for today's lecture, set of many lectures, is this big picture overview and key ecological concepts. Then in the future, we're going to pay more attention to particular choices that are made and the case studies from Amazon deforestation and water management. Okay, so just to finish off this mini lecture, I'm going to have 3 slides about the idea of planetary boundaries. So planetary boundaries, and it was introduced in the syllabus as one of the kind of key things I want you to get out of this, is these are concepts which were developed over the last, say, 15 years about how we can think about how the Earth's systems, which we've known about for many, many years, how the Earth's systems interact and how what we do as people affects those systems. So without people, the planet would be carrying on nicely and would have a more natural state, perhaps as we might have seen prior to the Industrial Revolution. So if we looked at the planet 300 to 400 years ago, these systems would be, we would see a more natural version of these systems. People have come along since the Industrial Revolution, since our population has grown so rapidly, since we've changed it so much, we have become much more of a force. So this idea of planetary boundaries is to what extent are we a force at the global scale? And what are the key systems? So this group from the Stockholm Resilience Center, led by the Stockholm Resilience Center, particularly Johan Rockström here and Willem Steffen, have done a lot of thinking about that, and they've tried to kind of simplify it in a way, these very complex processes, multiple processes, global processes, to this idea of what's the safe operating space for humanity relative to 9 big picture Earth systems. So these are the Earth systems that they have identified. Ozone depletion. So ozone filters ultraviolet rays. If we deplete the ozone layer, the atmospheric layer, then we're going to be more exposed to ultraviolet rays and the health and ecosystem consequences of that. Biosystem integrity is about both biodiversity loss and extinction, as well as the functional value of biodiversity to our planet and to the other systems. The third thing is novel entities. So these are things which we would not have seen kind of aggregated at the Earth's surface or in our water bodies or on the surface of the Earth before. So things like chemicals, which we are either synthetic or we have made, and we're using these chemicals that are now bioaccumulating in different places, as well as heavy metals, not metals, but heavy metals, like cadmium and magnesium, which are now showing up in new places and maybe getting into our food systems. Fourth one is a big one on climate change, which we'll get into extensively. Fifth one is due to the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere associated with climate change, there's another effect other than just other than just warming the planet, having more disturbed climate system, disturbed weather. There's also dissolving of carbon dioxide in oceans, and as it dissolves, it forms carbonic acid, which has an effect on the ocean systems themselves. So this is something that isn't so well known, but seems an alarm bell for many related to climate change, something we haven't fully come to grips with yet. There's a water cycle that ties things together. There is land system change. So how much are we changing the land base by our activities in agriculture and other human activities like mining? There are nitrogen and phosphorus, so N stands for nitrogen and P stands for phosphorus. There's nitrogen and phosphorus flows. So we're going to talk about nitrogen cycle, and there's also a more kind of lateral flow of phosphorus. And then we could think about aerosol loading, so different types of air pollution that affect Earth systems. Okay. So these groups of scientists have looked at these 9 areas, which are seen as sort of the 9 spokes of this wheel, and in green indicated whether they think, and that dark line around the green bar there, around the kind of the first big circle emanated from the hub. What's the kind of, how well are we doing? Are we operating within, say, our safe operating space on ozone depletion? We say, well, yes, we had actually a major ozone kind of problem. And there was great concern about that about 30 years ago. And we've actually done a good job of dealing with it. We actually are living within that ozone depletion kind of safe operating space for humanity. We're not making the problem worse. In fact, we may be making the problem better, which is surprising to us. How about ocean acidification? Has that gotten to the level where we have kind of irreversible big changes due to human effects? And I think, their conclusion is we're still okay now, though it's somewhat more alarming that is the case for ozone depletion. They say also we're pretty good shape still in freshwater use. You'll see that we're using about 70% of the freshwater we use in agriculture, but at the global scale, there's still lots of freshwater which we aren't heavily using. So think about places like Canada, we're still not heavily using that. This is something which certainly varies a lot more than some of these other systems from kind of place to place, where freshwater use in some parts of the world is much more alarming than it is in other parts of the world. So we'll get to that later. In the areas where we see yellow, say just yellow, then we're sort of in a caution zone. We're not sure if we're going to be causing irreversible change from the planet in these systems or not, and that is climate change so far. So far, you know, at the sort of 1.5 degree above long-term historical averages that we're at. You know, maybe we can live within that. With the amount of land system change, perhaps we can live with that. But there's uncertainty and there are question marks. In these two other areas, genetic diversity and the phosphorus and nitrogen, we're in the red zone already. We are clearly having long-term negative effects by what we're doing. We're reducing the number of species, and we'll see that. I'll give you some statistics in a minute. We are causing irreversible changes to the nitrogen cycles and also to phosphorus. And then there are three areas that they show as being that we just don't have enough information to say what's safe, what's not safe, what's uncertain, and that's air pollution of different kinds, things like chemical pollution with the novel entities, and then functional diversity. And that's not just, that's how does biodiversity shape the Earth's systems? And how much do you need? Do you need all of the species, or can you get by with losing some of them? So that's a question we really don't have enough information on. So this is quite an alarming state of affairs. That this is from a paper published in 2015, and sort of a wake-up signal for humanity. I urge you to watch these three videos, which go into this idea of the planetary boundaries and how agriculture affects that. The first one that I would point out is the Johan Rockström TED Talk on Let the Planet Guide Our Development in 2010. So there are, really all of that would be great for you to watch. Johan Rockström became the co-chair of something called the Eat-Lancet Commission, which released a report in the beginning of 2019 on, can humanity live within planetary boundaries in the way we do agriculture and what we eat? So they have two elements. There's sort of a dietary element, this idea of sustainable diets, which is really covered in the first part of this video. And then a second part, which is about, okay, if this is what we need and we can contain the amount that we need by changing our diets and our food habits, can we actually do an agriculture in a way which allows us to live within the planetary boundaries? The answer is yes, we can, but not if we continue as business as usual, that we will need to make major changes in the way that we produce our food. Related to those things is a great video by Jonathan Foley, also another TED Talk about land use at the global scale that he calls the other inconvenient truth. And his inconvenient truth is that agriculture has a massive effect on land use around the planet. And I'm going to give you some of the data for that. So that's this kicks this off. I'm going to take a break here and then come back with a second mini lecture.